It's time to let the day fall away now. You've done enough. There's nothing left to hold or fix or finish. All that's needed now is for you to rest, to let your body sink down into the softness beneath you, your arms growing heavier, your breathing slower. Let your thoughts gently float like snowflakes, light, silent, and aimless, melting before they ever reach the ground. With every breath in, feel a little warmth bloom in your chest, and with every breath out, let go of tension you didn't even know you were holding. Your jaw unclenches, your shoulders drop, your legs go limp and quiet. You're safe, you're warm. And tonight we're going somewhere far away, yet strangely familiar. Tonight's story takes us back over 100 years, to a world of frosted window panes, coal smoke curling in the dusk, and thick woolen coats hung by the fire. Our story today begins on a quiet Edwardian morning, somewhere in rural England, around the year 1907. The sun is slow to rise, and the frost clings stubbornly to the thatched roofs and glass panes of cottages that dot the countryside. A soft wind sighs across the moorland, carrying the scent of cold earth and chimney soot. This is a time before central heating, before insulation, before modern winter boots or electric lights. And yet, they survived, gracefully, stubbornly, ingeniously. Inside a narrow stone cottage, nestled at the edge of the village, a woman named Lydia stirs beneath layers of quilts. Her room smells faintly of old lavender and the soot-dusted stone hearth built into the wall. The fire, banked carefully with ashes the night before, is still faintly glowing something her grandmother taught her to do, so the warmth could be coaxed back with just a few sticks in the early light. She blinks slowly, wrapped in wool, stockings, flannel, and a bonnet she never removed before sleep. That was the custom in colder Edwardian households. You dressed for sleep almost as heavily as you dressed for day. Beds were piled with rough wool blankets, feather-stuffed coverlets, and often, if you were lucky, a heated brick wrapped in cloth slipped under the sheets to stave off the freeze. The air in the room is cold enough that you can see your breath, but it's a still cold, a kind cold. The kind that sharpens sound, makes the creaking of the floorboards feel deeper, more honest. Lydia slips out of bed and into her boots, kept near the fire so they wouldn't freeze stiff. She pads into the kitchen where the kettle waits by the iron stove. It will take time for the coals to burn hot enough to boil water, but that's all right. Mornings are slow here. Her fingers are pink with cold, but practiced. She works quickly, setting the kindling, striking the match. There's a rhythm to it, a domestic ritual, almost meditative. And soon the stove begins to tick and groan as it comes alive again, radiating the first real heat of the day. In towns and cities, Edwardian families had to make different kinds of preparations. Those who could afford it lived in terraced houses with fireplaces in nearly every room, each one needing coal. And so the coalman came each week, his face dark with soot, shouldering great burlap sacks. Children would watch through the windows as he filled the scuttle beside the door, careful not to spill too much on the stoop. Coal was expensive. People burned it slowly, often banking fires through the night to save fuel, layering ash over embers to keep them smoldering. And if the fire went out, you would have to start again from scratch in the morning, cracking ice off the water bucket, your breath misting like fog in the hallway. In poor homes, you shared a bed with siblings, or even with boarders, not just for warmth, but because warmth was survival. A single person in an unheated room could become dangerously cold before dawn, so you shared body heat. You covered windows with thick drapes or even rugs. You laid straw, mats, or animal pelts across the floorboards to stop the drafts from coming up between the planks. In some parts of the countryside, window panes were rubbed with goose fat to keep them from freezing solid, and old newspapers were used as makeshift insulation in wall gaps and door frames. But there was beauty, too, a kind of slow, quiet elegance to Edwardian winters, the way lamp oil flickered through frosted glass, the way boots were lined with old wool and set by the fire in preparation for a walk through the snow, the way bread dough rose slowly beside the stove, warming in the quietest corner of the kitchen. In Lydia's house there's an old grandmother clock in the hallway. It ticks softly, echoing through the wooden floor. She sets the breakfast table in silence, porridge, and treacle. Today, the children will rise soon, rubbing their eyes and reaching for warmth, their cheeks still pink from sleep. The baby's cot has been pulled near the stove, and a curtain drawn around it to keep out the chill. That's how they did it, strategic, thoughtful. A constant game of conserving warmth, preserving comfort. Clothing was layered meticulously. Long woolen undergarments beneath petticoats or breeches. Stockings, knit gloves, scarves wound around your face. Children wore wool gaiters buttoned around the calves, and mittens sewn onto strings that ran through the sleeves of their coats, so they wouldn't lose them. Frost would creep in through the keyholes and settle in a fine dust on the windowsill, but inside the kettle steamed. A cat slept curled on a folded coat. A pair of slippers waited patiently by the hearth. Everything had its place in the quiet routine of surviving winter, not with panic, but with patience. Evening brought its own hush. Oil lamps glowed amber and golden. Bread crusts were toasted over open flames, and stories were passed around the table like bowls of stew. Every Edwardian winter day was shaped by an understanding. The cold could not be defeated, but it could be tamed. Slowly, gently. Together. As the light outside began to fade into the cool gray hush of afternoon, the village quieted with it. In Edwardian towns and hamlets, winter was a time of smaller footsteps, softer voices, and shortened days. The sun barely lifted above the horizon before it began its descent again, casting long blue shadows across cobblestone alleys and white, dusted pastures. Inside Lydia's cottage, the fire had been carefully stoked to a bright and gentle roar, not too large to waste coal, but steady enough to keep the room at a comforting warmth. It was the center of the home, both physically and emotionally, drawing in every member of the family like moths to soft light. Outside the windows, frost etched delicate fern-like patterns on the glass. They looked like feathers or the veins of frozen leaves. These were not mere decorations of winter, but a kind of quiet reminder from nature that even in its coldest, harshest moments, beauty remained. Lydia's son, Thomas, traced the patterns with his finger, watching the ice melt under his touch. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with a constant curiosity that often had him kneeling near the hearth or peering under cabinets in search of mice or misplaced yarn. By this hour, the chores had already been completed, the hens given their grain. The cows milked quickly in the freezing barn, their breath steaming in the still air. In the Edwardian era, winters weren't an excuse to rest. They were a test of discipline. Every task was harder in the cold. Water buckets froze solid. Red dough needed extra time to rise. Tools became brittle and hands chapped red from repeated washing. But still, life went on. Supper was often simple, but hearty root vegetables, barley stews, boiled cabbage, with suet dumplings. The meals were designed to warm from the inside out. Everything was boiled or stewed, cooked long and slow on the cast-iron range. The smell alone was comforting thick, with herbs, onions, and the earthy sweetness of parsnips. Lydia ladled it carefully into bowls, her hands wrapped in the ends of her apron to keep the chill off. There were no timers or electric stoves. She judged the doneness by scent, by steam, by the way the bubbling softened in sound when it was ready. Her daughter, Eliza, helped slice a crust of brown bread as steam rose gently into the air. In many Edwardian homes, bread was made twice a week in bulk and stored in linen to keep it from going stale. It was cut carefully, every slice precious. Food waste was almost unthinkable in this era. Even the scraps had purpose: potato peels for broth, bones for stock, crusts for feeding chickens, or soaking in milk for pudding. Winter was a season of mindfulness, of making do, of stretching every ounce of comfort as far as it would go. And when the meal was done and the bowls were scraped clean with the last corner of bread, the family would settle into the warmth of the firelight. This was the time for stories. Not loud, dramatic ones, but soft, whispered tales about the world outside their door. About the woods that lined the fields, where foxes curled under hedges and owls blinked from frozen branches. About the distant city, where electric lamps were slowly replacing gas lights, and where children wore polished boots and watched carriages from tall apartment windows. But here, in this cottage, there was no electricity, only the crackle of fire and the rhythmic ticking of the grandmother clock. Lydia's husband, Arthur, leaned back in his chair with a book in his lap, the spine worn thin from decades of use. It was a book of weather sayings and countryside lore, how to predict snow by the color of the sunrise, or what kind of frost meant a coming thaw. These were not superstitions. They were survival skills. He read aloud in a soft voice while Eliza stitched a hole in her glove, and Thomas yawned, curled under a quilt on the floor. The room grew darker as the fire settled low, casting soft, dancing shadows against the walls. Occasionally they could hear the wind outside, a moaning whistle through the cracks in the eaves. But inside they were cocooned in warmth and ritual. Candles were lit in heavy brass holders. Their flames flickered gently, throwing a pale gold across the table. Lydia moved with practiced ease, checking that the windows were latched tight, the drapes drawn thick. These weren't just customs, they were safeguards. Heavy velvet curtains were used not only for decoration, but to keep out the chill. And rugs weren't just for underfoot. They were hung on walls in some homes, layered between doors, even used to seal off stairwells. In grander Edwardian houses, those of the gentry or wealthy merchants, the methods were more extravagant, but the principle was the same. Corridors were often closed off in winter, unused rooms shut tight. Servants would place warming pans filled with hot coals between the sheets before bed. Cloaks and fur-lined garments were worn inside as often as outside. And for the elite, there were footmen trained to keep the fireplaces lit constantly, rotating between rooms to keep the temperature livable. But in homes like Lydia's, you made the fire last as long as possible and taught the children how to stretch a coal's warmth into the next day. It was a dance quiet, repetitive, ancient. And as night fell fully, with the sky outside turning ink black and dusted with stars, the bedtime ritual began. Eliza and Thomas were helped into their sleep garments, not delicate nightgowns or pajamas, but wool underlayers, scarves, and knit caps. Their beds were pushed close together. A hot brick wrapped in flannel slipped between the covers, and extra blankets piled one atop another until only the tips of their noses showed. The wind rattled softly at the windows, but it could not come in. The fire's last breath glowed in the hearth. Arthur extinguished the last candle. Lydia whispered a prayer for the morning sun to rise safely, and one by one the family drifted into sleep wrapped in layers, comfort, and the quiet strength of another winter day survived. In the deepest part of the night, when the moon hovered cold and white above the chimney pots, the Edwardian countryside lay utterly still. The world outside was a sheet of frost, crystalline and blue, beneath the starlight. You could almost hear it settling the frozen breath of the earth itself. Trees stood like statues, bare and sleeping. Thatched roofs and narrow lanes held their silence, blanketed in soft layers of winter quiet. But inside the cottage, beneath quilts and tucked-in scarves, life slept on in warmth and stillness. The fire in the hearth had dulled to embers now, a faint orange thread glowing beneath a veil of ash. This was how Edwardians learned to sleep through the cold, not with thermostats or radiators, but with planning, layering, and routine. A hot brick at the foot of the bed was common, wrapped in thick linen or an old towel. It held its heat just long enough to carry one into dreams. Some families even used hot potatoes, cooked earlier in the day, wrapped and nestled beneath blankets. They would cool by morning, but in those first few precious hours, they were tiny suns beneath the sheets. Sleep came easier when the day was full of simple tasks and predictable rhythms. In the Edwardian era, most people rose with the sun and wound down with the dark. There were no glowing screens, no loud distractions, no electric buzz. Just firelight, quiet voices, and the low hum of winter wind moving through the eaves. Sleep was natural, deep, and long. The body followed the season. In winter it slowed, it conserved, it let go, and as dawn approached again, Lydia stirred beneath her wool covers. A single candle was lit to guide her way, just enough to see the floor, the stove, the shape of her husband's coat hung on a nail. The candle's scent was faintly of beeswax, the flame steady and small. She moved slowly, careful not to wake the children. In Edwardian households, mornings were sacred. They began early, quietly, and deliberately. Lydia's first task was always the stove. She used a small metal poker to shift the ashes, searching for that tiny pulse of remaining heat. If it was gone, she'd need to start again. But this morning she was lucky just enough glow to catch kindling if she moved quickly. She fretted splinters of wood and dried moss, blowing gently, coaxing it into flame. The first flicker of warmth bloomed, and with it the comfort of routine. Water was poured from a covered bucket into a kettle, its surface rimmed with a fine skin of ice. In Edwardian homes, water was stored carefully overnight, often covered in cloth to keep the chill from setting in too deeply. Still it froze. That was normal, just another part of winter living. Lydia set the kettle on the stove, then moved to stir the porridge pot-soaked oats from the night before, ready to cook. Nothing was wasted. Time, food, fuel, all were treated with reverence. As the heat returned to the kitchen, the room began to feel more alive. The cat leapt down from the windowsill and stretched before curling near the stove. Eliza stirred in the next room, her feet padding across the floorboards. boots in hand. She had school today, and the journey would be cold. Most Edwardian children walked long distances to school, even in snow. Coats were buttoned to the chin, scarves wrapped twice, gloves layered if needed. But still, fingers numbed, noses reddened. It was simply part of life. Before leaving, Lydia wrapped Eliza's scarf in extra time and tucked a hand-knitted sachet of dried lavender into her coat pocket. Lavender was believed to calm the nerves and warm the spirit, an old custom passed down through generations of women. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it was just the kindness of the gesture that warmed the heart. Thomas, too young for school, spent his morning helping Arthur mend tools. The garden spade had split near the handle from the cold, and the wooden rake needed oiling. In the Edwardian era, you fixed things yourself. You preserved them. Even the smallest household had a tool kit, a sewing tin, a cabinet filled with oil bottles, rags, spare buttons. Nothing was disposable, not really. Time was slower, but more intentional. Arthur, though quiet, moved with purpose. He was a man shaped by seasons, by the tempo of land and weather. He'd grown up in this same cottage, and his father before him. The walls remembered their names, their footsteps, their winters. He hummed as he worked, an old tune from the harvest days, something comforting in its melody. Lydia watched the two of them from the doorway. Her apron was dusted with flour, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the kitchen. There was a peace in this life, a hard peace, yes, but one that made you feel deeply, quietly, that you belonged to something older than yourself, something enduring. By late morning, the snow outside had begun to fall again, soft, lazy flakes that drifted down in no rush at all. Edwardian windows didn't seal well, so Lydia took extra care. She checked the draft stoppers along the sills, rolled woolen tubes that blocked the cold wind, and tucked extra rags into the corners of the frame. In fancier homes they had velvet pelmets and thick-lined curtains. In the cottages you did what you could. Sometimes that meant nailing old quilts to the walls or stuffing newspaper into the fireplace flue when it wasn't in use. And still, it was beautiful. Winter in the Edwardian countryside held a kind of magic, a slow, silvery kind. Snow muffled the world outside. Time moved slower. The church bell tolled noon like it had for centuries, its sound echoing across the village rooftops. From the kitchen window, Lydia could see the distant smoke from a neighbor's chimney curling into the pale sky. Each plume a sign of life, of warmth, of someone else facing the cold and pushing it back with tea and firewood. As the children returned and the afternoon waned, Lydia began to prepare supper. Tonight it would be leek and potato soup with oatcakes. She moved with calm, practiced hands, chopping with a worn knife, stirring slowly, letting the heat build low and even. Edwardian meals weren't fast, but they were nourishing. Simmered long, seasoned with what little could be spared from the pantry or grown in the frost-touched garden. Outside, darkness began to fall again. The snow continued its gentle descent, and the windows glowed faintly golden from within. Another day was ending, and once more they had made it through. As twilight deepened, the world outside became a quiet, painting snow, clinging to stone walls. The sharp branches of trees silhouetted against a lavender sky, and lanterns glowing behind frosted panes like watchful eyes keeping vigil over the earth. The village had long since retreated into its own hush. Footsteps faded, doors shut tight. and smoke curled in thin ribbons from chimneys, signaling hearths alive and glowing within. Inside Lydia's cottage, the supper had been served and eaten in peaceful, satisfied quiet. The soup had warmed their hands and their bellies. The oat cakes, though plain, had been buttered generously, their edges crisp from the iron griddle. Everyone sat a little longer at the table, now not because they weren't finished eating, but because the warmth and company were too lovely to leave just yet. That was the nature of Edwardian evenings in winter. Slow, gentle, ritualistic. Not a performance, but a rhythm. A way of being that matched the season conserving, honoring, preparing. After supper, Lydia took to her small embroidery hoop. She didn't sew for decoration alone. These stitches were purposeful mending Eliza's dress, reinforcing the hem of Arthur's work trousers, adding a warmer lining to Thomas's mittens. But even in the necessity of her work, there was beauty. Tiny blue threads sewn in the shape of snowdrops. A line of cross-stitch along a collar, where none was strictly needed. In Edwardian homes, functionality and artistry often intertwined. What you wore, what you ate, even how you kept warm, it could all carry some trace of care, of expression. Thomas sat on a braided rug by the fire, pulling a toy cart behind him, made from a wooden box and old chair wheels. It had been Arthur's once, made by hand when he was a boy, passed down through storms and cold seasons and long indoor days. These toys, simple, silent, held a kind of power. They weren't distractions. They were companions. Play in the Edwardian winter wasn't loud. It wasn't cluttered. It was made from imagination, and always under the watchful eye of the hearth. The fire, by now, was a low and steady flame, just enough to warm the sitting room. Wood was precious. Coal was even more so. Each piece placed into the grate was counted and considered. In households across the country, firewood was rationed by room, by day, sometimes by hour. The front parlor might remain closed for weeks, saved only for visitors or Christmas gatherings, while the family lived around the kitchen stove and huddled in one shared room. In grander Edwardian estates, this winter frugality took a different shape. Thick velvet drapes were drawn at dusk with ceremonial precision. Draught excluders, sometimes sewn to resemble long sleeping dogs, were placed at the base of each door. Bedrooms had fireplaces, but many remained unlit for most of the season to save on expense. Even the wealthy respected the cold and managed it strategically. Gilded rooms could still bite with chill. The middle classes, however, were masters of invention. The Edwardian era, perched on the edge of modernity, saw a flurry of curious domestic gadgets. There were hot water bottles made from thick stoneware, bed-warming pans with long brass handles, and even foot-warming stools, hollow wooden boxes, with a coal pan inside and holes in the top to slip your feet into like a small personal hearth. These devices were cherished, maintained, and sometimes passed down like family heirlooms. In Lydia's cottage they had none of those luxuries, but what they had instead was habit, wisdom, and each other. As the evening wore on, she reached for the small tin that held their night-time remedies, a twist of beeswax for dry hands, a spoonful of honey and lemon for Arthur's cough, lavender oil dabbed on the children's collars to help them sleep more soundly. These weren't store-bought comforts. They were homemade, steeped in memory, old wives' tales, and gentle science. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world blanketed in moonlit white. It was the kind of quiet that made even the tiniest sound a creak of a floorboard, the snap of a log feel deep and meaningful. Lydia moved through the house with a candle in hand, checking the windows once more. She tucked extra cloth under the front door. She looked in on the children. Thomas, already fast asleep, had buried himself under the blankets, with only a tuft of dark hair showing. Eliza pretended to sleep, but Lydia could see the faint curl of a smile at the corner of her mouth. She kissed her forehead and let her rest. Upstairs, the bedroom was cold. The stone walls kept the day's chill locked in like a cellar. Lydia and Arthur prepared for bed slowly, layering wool socks and sleep robes. The bed was already heavy with quilts, 3 thick ones, each hand-stitched by a different generation of women in the family. Some were patchwork, others plain, all well-worn and lovingly mended. Before slipping beneath them, Arthur placed the fire-warmed brick at the foot of the bed. It would be cold again by morning, but for now, it gave off a deep, grounding heat. As they lay down, the candle flickered softly on the knit-stand. Their breathing settled into the same rhythm. The wind outside howled once, then fell still. Inside these walls, it could not reach them. And so another Edwardian winter night passed, not in fear or in haste, but in small, thoughtful choices, in shared warmth. In familiar hands, they didn't conquer the winter. They folded into it, lived with it, moved gently, and survived together. By the time the next morning arrived, the frost had thickened into a crust across every visible surface. Icicles hung from the eaves like frozen daggers, sharp and glinting in the pale golden light of dawn. But within the stone walls of Lydia's cottage, the rhythm of survival ticked steadily forward. Even the coldest days were met with calm acceptance, never panic. It was not a question of whether winter would come, only how one would endure it and whether one did so with grace. The morning routine unfolded once more, each task stitched into muscle memory. Lydia's fingers, stiff at first, warmed quickly by the stove as she rekindled the coals. She was grateful again that the embers had lasted, grateful for her grandmother's teaching, for the proper layering of ash and air. Fire in winter was a science passed down woman to woman, more sacred than any recipe. It had to be coaxed, never rushed, had to be respected always. As the room began to fill with warmth, a quiet steam began to rise from the kettle, and the familiar scent of oats soaked overnight returned to the air. The simplest of foods, but in winter, oatmeal became something of a constant comfort, warm, filling, slow to digest. Thomas, rubbing his eyes, came down wrapped in a shawl far too large for him. He looked like a bundled ghost, all curls and wool, blinking into the morning light. Lydia pulled him close. His skin was cold, but his hands, tucked against her apron, found warmth again. Outside, smoke rose from chimneys, up and down the narrow lane. One by one, homes reawakened. Neighbors emerged briefly to tend to animals, collect firewood, or knock snow from the paths. They nodded silently to one another through the mist, the shared acknowledgment of those enduring the same long season. No need for words, just a look that said, yes, we're still here. Still warm, still together. Eliza's boots were stiff with frost, and Lydia held them near the stove to soften. It was one of many small rituals that made winter manageable. Boots dried by the hearth, socks placed between bed sheets before sleep, gloves warmed between palms before being worn. All of it designed to ease the shock of the cold, to prepare the body for the day ahead. In Edwardian times, every task could be made bearable through rhythm, repetition, and a kind of quiet affection. And then came washing day. Though dreaded by many, wash day was non-negotiable. Winter didn't stop laundry from piling up, and Edwardian families had no laundry machines, no indoor plumbing to ease the labor. Instead, they heated water on the stove, poured it into great tin tubs, and stirred clothes with wooden paddles. Lydia's hands were raw from these mornings. Even indoors the water chilled too quickly. Soap froze if left uncovered. Yet still she scrubbed. Garments were wrung out over the sink, then hung across the kitchen on a rope strung from beam to beam, where the warmth of the stove would coax out the moisture slowly over hours, sometimes days. The children were forbidden from playing near the wet laundry. Their breath might chill the cloth, and then it would never dry. In many homes, drying clothes meant hanging them near the bed, where the heat of bodies and the trapped breath of sleep would slowly wick away the last dampness overnight. Clothes didn't smell of artificial scents then. They smelled of ash and wind, of damp wool and soap flakes, the scent of survival. The air in the kitchen was thick with steam and stove heat. Outside the cold deepened, but within these walls warmth pooled like syrup in the corners. It wasn't constant, never overwhelming, but it was enough. Enough to banish the sting in fingers, enough to loosen stiff joints, enough to let the baby sleep in peace. Lydia took a moment to sit by the window, hands folded in her lap, steam curling from her tea. The snow outside sparkled like crushed glass. From here she could see the well behind the house, half buried now. In winter, water had to be drawn early before it froze over. Buckets were kept indoors to prevent splitting from the cold, and the rope had to be checked daily for stiffness. So many details. So many small things to remember, each one critical. But Lydia never complained. She knew winter wasn't something you fought. It was something you outlasted. And in that outlasting, there was pride. Arthur returned from the shed with a basket of chopped wood. His breath fogged the air, and snow clung to the folds of his coat. He said nothing as he passed her, just reached out a gloved hand and brushed a curl from her cheek. A simple act. But in the Edwardian winter, love was often shown in quiet gestures, in carrying wood, in warming boots, in slicing the thick heel of bread and offering the crustiest end to the one you loved most. As midday arrived, the sun rose just high enough to soften the snow on the windowsills. It was not warmth exactly, but the suggestion of it a reminder that the world was still turning, that spring still lived somewhere behind the clouds. And in that pale light, the family gathered again, not for celebration, not for spectacle, but simply because that's what winter required. Togetherness, stillness, shared heat and shared silence. They did not rush. There was nowhere to go, no appointments, no trains to catch, no urgency beyond the fire, the soup, and the rhythm of the season. And so they lived like this hour by hour, day by day, not waiting for the cold to end, but moving with it, embracing it, for this too would pass. Afternoons in Edwardian winter drifted by like snowflakes, slow, silent, and dissolving before you could hold them too tightly. Time didn't pass in hours, not really. It passed in tasks and glances out the window, in the sound of the fire shifting in its grate, or the steady tick of a wall-mounted clock. Lydia moved through her home like a figure in a snow globe, everything around her still, suspended, softened by the thick curtain of winter that had settled over the countryside. After lunch, she placed a pot of dried apple and cloves on the stove to simmer. It wasn't necessary, but it was one of her quiet indulgences. The warmth of the fruit and spice would wind its way through the house, gently scenting the linens and wool, lifting the spirits of the children. In the Edwardian world, scent was memory. There were no plug-in diffusers or candles with clever names. There were boiling peels, hanging lavender, the occasional pomander, tucked into a cupboard. It was scent as comfort, scent as healing. Eliza returned from school with cheeks like rose petals, chapped and flushed from the walk. Her boots were wet, her scarf damp with breath, but she wore a grin all the same. Her satchel held her copybook and a small tin pencil case, the lead inside worn nearly to a nub. Lydia unwrapped her scarf, hung it near the fire to dry, and helped her change into thicker stockings. Clothes were worn in layers changed and relayered as the day unfolded. Dampness was dangerous. A single wet sleeve could chill a child into fever, so Lydia had learned to watch for it, to touch and test for dampness with gentle fingers trained by many winters. Arthur's boots were by the door now, polished not with wax, but with lard, a trick passed down from a neighbor whose father had marched with a regiment during the frostbitten campaigns. Fat, sealed leather from the wet and kept it supple in the cold. These small tricks, these quiet hacks of Edwardian life, were everywhere, taught at tables, passed between generations, shared over fences or in letters from older cousins. It was community knowledge, not written in books, but etched into behavior. The children sat at the table now, huddled close under a shared shawl, elbows brushing as they worked. Thomas was practicing his letters, brow furrowed, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth. Eliza read aloud from a penny novel she'd borrowed, a moral tale full of snowy villages and characters who always seemed to suffer before they triumphed. The story's fiction mirrored their truth. Life in the Edwardian winter was often hard, but its small victories, hot tea, a good cold delivery, boots that didn't leak, were felt deeply. Outside, the sky had dimmed once more, not because it was evening, but because the light of winter always seemed reluctant, always seemed half-hearted. It wasn't darkness exactly, just a quiet grayness that softened all edges. Shadows stretched long over the snow. Trees reached crooked arms toward the low clouds. And overhead, smoke from the village chimneys rose in slow, deliberate spirals. Lydia watched from the window for a long moment, her hands still, resting on the frame. In the distance, a cart creaked slowly down the lane wheels frozen with rime, horses stamping and snorting against the bitter wind. The coalman, she guessed, or perhaps the tinsmith, come to collect broken pots. Tradesmen came rarely in the worst of winter, and their arrival was met with a sort of reverent welcome, not just for the service they brought, but for the connection, the reminder that the world beyond your gate had not entirely disappeared beneath the snow. When evening came again, it did so like a sigh, a quiet drawing in, a gathering of wool blankets and fading lamplight. Lydia lit the oil lamp in the center of the kitchen and trimmed the wick carefully, watching the flame rise into steady bloom. The lamp glass was fogged from years of use, but it still threw soft shadows across the walls, just enough to cook by, to read by, to live by. Tonight's meal was barley and turnip stew, thick, unhurried, stirred with a wooden spoon worn smooth as bone. She added a scrap of smoked meat from a parcel Arthur had bartered for wrapped in paper and carried home like treasure. Meat was a luxury in winter, preserved, portioned, stretched across days. Each bite carried the memory of the summer sun that had raised it, the smokehouse where it had been dried, the hand that had cured it with salt and patience. Eating in winter was never just sustenance. It was history, memory, and hope bundled into every mouthful. They ate in silence mostly. The fire popped and hissed in the background, and Thomas hummed softly between bites. No one was in a hurry. There was nowhere to be. No noise but the sounds of breath and spoons and the distant wind moving through the trees. Lydia's gaze lingered on her children, rosy in the lamplight, and for a moment she felt the warmth rise deeper than any fire could provide. This was survival, but it was also life. After the meal, the routine repeated quiet clearing of plates, washing dishes in lukewarm water, drying hands on the same cloth used a dozen times before. There was no waste, no rushing, no reason to do things anyway, but slowly. Then came the slippering of feet into warm shoes, the wrapping of shoulders in knit shawls, the placing of the final log into the hearth for the night. Everything had a rhythm. Everything was done in the same order, with the same care. It was a kind of meditation, a way of slipping gently into the arms of the dark. When the time came for sleep again, the fire was banked with ashes. The children climbed into their beds, now doubled with blankets, borrowed from the chest at the foot. Their breath misted in the air above them for only a moment before the quilts swallowed them whole. Eliza clutched a small cloth doll. Thomas curled up like a kitten, his feet tucked beneath him. Lydia kissed them both and lingered in the doorway a while, watching as their faces relaxed into slumber, the kind of slumber that only comes when the body is weary and the heart is full. Outside, the snow began again, a soft patter against the panes, as if the sky was tucking them in. And in the glow of the dying fire, with the scent of clove still hanging faintly in the air, another Edwardian day folded itself closed. That night, as the wind returned in low, hollow breaths curling beneath doors, rattling the corners of loose shutters, the house stood steady against it, a warm shell against the cold world beyond. The snow whispered across the roof tiles, and in the darkness the sound of branches brushing the eaves was like the dragging of fingers over silk. But inside, wrapped in stillness and heat and the layered weight of quilts, the family slept. And in that sleep, the old rhythm of the Edwardian winter continued its quiet pulse. Not far from Lydia's cottage, in the village's modest churchyard, snow had blanketed the old headstones until they looked like sleeping giants, rounded, softened, almost peaceful. The bells would not ring tonight, not until morning, but sometimes in the silence you could imagine them anyway, their sound carried in memory more than air. In many Edwardian villages, the church was not just a place of worship. It was a keeper of time, of temperature, even of safety. Some churches opened their doors during harsh, cold spells, letting in the poorest to huddle beneath pews, to find shelter when even straw and brick failed to hold in the warmth. Back in the cottage, the fire had died down to its faintest red pulse embers, like the heart of the house, beating slower with every hour. Lydia stirred in her sleep, not from cold, but from instinct. Edwardian women often half woke in the night to adjust blankets, to check that feet were still warm, to shift children if they had kicked off their layers. It wasn't worry exactly, it was simply care, the kind that moved quietly, without fanfare. In the barn behind the house, Arthur had bedded the animals earlier in the evening with fresh straw. Even livestock were treated with particular caution in winter. Cows and goats were blanketed with burlap sacks, chickens covered with sacks of cloth at night, their breath forming gentle steam in the cold air. Frostbitten ears and cracked hooves were not uncommon. Edwardians knew their survival was tethered to their animals. Feed was rationed with math-like precision. A handful of grain lost to the snow could mean an empty pantry come spring. When the sun finally began its slow rise, painting the snow in faint ribbons of gold and pink, the world looked unchanged, and yet entirely new. The trees shimmered with frost. Icicles had lengthened, drawn down by gravity and ice and time. The world for a moment was a cathedral of white. Lydia was already awake. She moved through the kitchen slowly, her breath visible for the first few minutes, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of the kettle. The fire took longer to catch this morning. The night had been colder, but she was patient. She always was. She blew gently into the heart of the kindling until it responded, until a flicker became a flame, and a flame became a promise. With warmth rising once again, she soaked a cloth in warm water to wipe the windows clean of their frost. Behind each pane was a tiny world, the neighbor's cat crossing the road, the blacksmith's apprentice shoveling snow in heavy boots, a boy pulling a sled with a loaf of bread from the bakery wrapped in oilcloth. In the Edwardian winter, windows were more than just glass. They were thresholds, the only glimpse you had of the world when the cold was too deep to bear. Arthur came down the stairs slowly, every step creaking beneath his boots. He brought in wood and brushed the frost from his shoulders. On mornings like this, his joints ached with a stiffness he never mentioned. Edwardian men were expected to bear the cold without complaint. Instead, they developed quiet ways of coping, stretching beside the fire, soaking hands in warm water, wrapping scarves around knees beneath their trousers. Breakfast this day was simpler than most. Tea with milk, bread toasted on a wire rack over the fire, a smear of dripping or a spoon of jam, if any remained. The pantry was thinning. Winter always tested one's preparation. They had enough, but not much extra. Still, no one commented. The children ate their toast slowly, letting the warmth move through them. Even Thomas, who usually squirmed in his chair, sat quietly with his knees hugged to his chest, wrapped in a blanket like a coon. Lydia sat beside him, pressing a kiss into his hair. Her hands were rough from the cold cracks near the knuckles, dry patches along the sides of her fingers, but she didn't seem to mind. These were the hands of a winter mother, hands that stirred soup and pressed coats against children's shoulders, that folded blankets and tied laces and stoked fires in the quiet dark before dawn. Later that morning, she visited her neighbor, Mrs. Halberd, whose own husband had taken ill the week prior. Lydia carried a basket with soup wrapped in cloth and an extra pair of mittens she had knit for her. Visits in winter were always purposeful, not for gossip or distraction, but for support. In Edwardian villages, neighbors leaned on one another more in the cold months, lending butter, sharing firewood, swapping jars of pickled vegetables or cured meats. There were no safety nets but each other. Mrs. Halberd's home was darker inside. A single fire lit the back room, and steam rose in delicate curls from a wash basin in the corner. Lydia helped her adjust a draft stopper at the base of the door and checked the bedding on the old man's cot. She didn't say much, just sat a while, holding her neighbor's hand. There was comfort in company, even silent company. When she returned home, the snow had grown heavier again. The sky was low, dim, the color of old parchment. She moved carefully along the path, her boots crunching the new snow, the scarf across her nose damp from breath. And yet, as she stepped back into the house, into the warmth and light and smell of simmering onions and broth, she felt briefly, quietly grateful. For the fire, for the children's laughter upstairs, for the sound of Arthur splitting wood in the shed, for the way the windows fogged gently from within. It was not an easy life, but it was whole, and even in the dead of winter it was full of warmth. That afternoon unfolded in a slow hush, as snow continued its quiet descent in thick, feathery flakes, each one drifting like a falling thought, soft and without weight, layering the world in silence. The lane had disappeared again beneath the blanket of white. Fences had softened, footprints filled in, and yet inside the house the sound of gentle laughter and clinking spoons filled the kitchen with life. Eliza and Thomas sat on a thick woolen rug near the hearth, playing a game of dominoes laid out on an upturned wooden crate. Their cheeks still glowed from the warmth of the tea they'd sipped, mugs that had been warmed with water first. Another small Edwardian trick to hold the heat just a little longer. Lydia worked nearby, gently folding the laundry she had dried over the fire, a slow, mindful task that smelled of smoke, soap, and sun-bleached linen. She ran her hand over each item, not just to smooth it, but to check for lingering dampness, knowing how easily chill could creep into cloth and then into bone. Outside, a magpie fluttered briefly onto the windowsill, its feathers bright against the gray light. Liza whispered, "One for sorrow," without finishing the rhyme. In Edwardian times, such superstitions were part of everyday life. Children grew up surrounded by omens and sayings, small bits of inherited folklore that added shape to the cold days. You saluted a magpie. You never swept after sundown. You turned bread cut side down so it wouldn't attract the devil. These weren't fears, they were comfort. Tiny rituals that made a big world feel smaller, more manageable. Arthur stepped in from outside, stamping snow from his boots, a small armful of kindling cradled in his arms. His face was red from the wind, but his eyes were content. "It's powdery," he said softly, as though speaking any louder might upset the warmth in the room. He set the wood near the stove and hung his damp scarf on a hook near the chimney where the rising heat would dry it. The family understood without needing words. Wet garments were never left to freeze. Dampness was the enemy. Dry was life. As the fire was fed and the kettle returned to the heat, the home exhaled. The walls seemed to ease, the old wooden floor creaked less, and the whole cottage glowed with that amber stillness that only comes in winter's middle hours when the outside world fades, and you forget what noise even sounds like. This was also the time for mending. Edwardian winters frayed edges of fabric, of nerves, of boots and gloves and woolen caps. So Lydia brought out the mending basket again, placing it beside her chair. She stitched slowly, fingers trained through long repetition. She repaired socks with darning mushrooms, wooden tools, shaped like eggs that helped stretch the fabric taut. She patched knees, re-hemmed skirts, and tightened buttons. And with each stitch, she preserved not just the garment, but the life inside it. clothes weren't thrown away. They were fixed, reshaped, passed down. Eliza wore Lydia's old winter cloak, once shortened, now re-lengthened. Thomas's mittens had once belonged to his uncle, the initials inside worn almost to invisibility. Lydia didn't see these clothes as old. She saw them as remembered. As she worked, she glanced out the window again. The village was still cloaked in snow, but here and there, signs of life flickered lamplight behind the miller's windows. Smoke from the schoolmaster's chimney, a boy pulling a small sled stacked with kindling. No one shouted. No one hurried. The world moved slowly, bundled against itself. Dinner that night was humble. Boiled potatoes with cheese and onion, baked in the cast-iron pan. The smell filled the kitchen with a heartiness that made the children stir, even before being called. In Edwardian winter kitchens, meals like these were as much about the warmth as the nourishment. The oven heated the room. The scent lifted spirits, and the act of eating together wrapped the family in a kind of invisible shawl woven of presence, patience, and shared necessity. They ate with quiet gratitude. No one wasted. No one asked for more than they needed. Afterward, Arthur opened the Bible and read a passage aloud, not as a sermon, but as a tradition. A simple few verses about light and hope, chosen not for doctrine, but for rhythm. The words hung in the air like lullabies, soft and old, curling like smoke into the corners of the kitchen. Then came the candlelight hour. The fire burned low. The lamp was turned down, and one by one the family lit candles in tin holders placed on the mantel and along the shelves. Their flames flickered like stars caught in jars. The room glowed gold. Shadows danced gently on the walls. This was the magic time, the quietest hour, the time for reflection, for soft laughter, for holding hands beneath the blankets. Thomas yawned and crawled into Lydia's lap, eyes fluttering closed. His body still carried the scent of snow and smoke and porridge. She held him, rocking slightly, humming a melody too old to name. Eliza rested her head on Arthur's shoulder, his arm wrapped around her like a blanket. The fire snapped and a log shifted, revealing a pocket of glowing red within the ashes. It was nearly bedtime again. Lydia moved through the house, preparing the ritual of sleep. The last ember was coaxed, a final sweep of the hearth. A thick curtain drawn across the stairwell to hold the heat below. Upstairs the beds were relayered. The hot brick, warmed again and wrapped in cloth, was tucked beneath the quilts. Candles were blown out one by one, the smoke curling upward like gentle ghosts. And as the last light faded, and the family drifted once more into the soft embrace of slumber, the snow outside deepened, the wind softened, and winter wrapped the cottage in its hush once more. The night wrapped itself around the village like an old woolen shawl, heavy, warm in its own peculiar way, and silent. Outside the cottage the world was painted in monochrome, the trees black against the silver snow, their branches bowed beneath the weight of frost. The roads had vanished. Even the low stone walls that traced the sheep fields seemed to blend into the whiteness, becoming soft hills of snow rather than barriers. Nothing moved, not even the wind. The winter had grown still, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Inside, that stillness held a different shape. It was thick and warm, a hush broken only by the gentle creak of settling timbers and the sighs of sleeping breath. Upstairs, Eliza turned in her sleep, drawing her blanket up to her chin. Her doll had slipped to the floor, one button eye catching the faint glow of the moonlight seeping in between the gaps of the curtains. Thomas, curled into a ball, snored faintly, the innocent, content sound of a child whose world had always been kept safe by the quiet vigilance of routine Dot in the parents' room. The cold was heavier, but still not harsh. The bed sheets were chilled where the brick's heat had finally faded, but Arthur's arm around Lydia held a deeper human warmth. Neither of them fully woke, but like dancers shifting in the same dream, they moved closer, instinctively chasing each other's heat in the long Edwardian night. This was how winter shaped people, not with fear, but with closeness. Every room, every motion, every gesture revolved around preserving warmth, keeping comfort from escaping. And it wasn't just about fire and blankets. It was the warmth of routine, of known places, of spoken traditions and shared silences. It was a kind of emotional insulation, handed down generation by generation, refined in cold kitchens and beside smoky hearths. The village itself slept on. In some cottages, oil lamps were still lit watching over a newborn's cradle or the bedside of an aging parent. In others, the light had gone completely, leaving only the heartbeat of glowing coals and the occasional flicker of moonlight on glass. The morning came slowly again, creeping across the snowy fields with reluctant footsteps. Dawn in Edwardian winter wasn't sudden or golden. It was gray and hesitant, a slow lifting of the curtain. Lydia stirred first, as she always did. She stretched without sitting up, taking a moment to listen to the quiet tick of the wall clock, the muted wind, the absence of any urgent sound. That absence was a comfort. No sickness, no fallen tree, no burst pipe. Just the cold, steady, and familiar, waiting to be met with the day's first fire. She dressed quickly, layering wool over cotton, fingers trembling just slightly from the chill. She stepped into her boots, stuffed with newspaper the night before to hold their shape and soak up moisture. The fire was a patient thing today, sluggish from the wetness in the air. It took longer to catch, but she spoke to it under her breath, as she always did, coaxing it with kind words and soft encouragement, the way one might soothe a restless child. The children rose slowly, their voices soft and gravelly with sleep. Lydia laid their clothes by the stove to warm them before dressing. That was always her way, never letting them start the day cold if she could help it. She poured tea into their mugs and held them out for them to wrap their hands around, more for the heat than the drink itself. Breakfast was bread warmed over the fire with a smear of dripping and a boiled egg for each eggs, traded from the neighbor in exchange for a jar of last year's preserved quince. Every meal had a story. Every bite was linked to someone, some act of kindness, some long-ago summer moment when the fruit was ripe and the sun was high and winter felt far away. After breakfast, Arthur prepared to walk into the village proper. The post office had opened its doors again, and there was hope that the latest shipment of coal might be coming through by a horse cart later that week. He bundled himself with deliberate slowness. Long underwear, thick socks, his outer trousers, wool vest, 2 scarves, mittens, and a cap pulled low. His coat was heavy and well-oiled, the collar turned up against the wind. There was something noble about his silhouette in the doorway, like a knight preparing to ride into the white unknown. He smiled back at Lydia as he closed the door behind him, leaving only a rush of cold air and a flurry of snow to mark his passing. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Lydia and the children settled into their tasks. Eliza helped prepare a new batch of dough for the bread, her fingers covered in flour, her cheeks dappled with sun through the cracked glass. Thomas was tasked with polishing the iron kettle using a paste made from ash and vinegar. These we re the chores of winter, as much about occupation as necessity. There was no rush. Everything was done slowly, gently, in rhythm with the fire's breath. The house smelled of yeast and wool and the faint sweetness of stewing apples. Snow piled higher against the base of the house, but inside the light grew stronger. It danced off the walls. It glinted in puddles of melted frost. It made the kitchen feel, just for a moment, like spring had wandered in through the back door. At midday, Arthur returned with news of the coal delivery delayed again by the snow, but on its way. His cheeks were ruddy, his coat crusted in frost, but his eyes were alive. He held a small parcel in his gloved hands, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. A tin of treacle, gifted by the shopkeeper's wife for a story he'd told. A rare treat, Lydia knew. Enough to stretch across weeks if used sparingly. Enough to sweeten a loaf of bread. Enough to make winter feel, if only for a moment, less sharp. They ate their lunch together, then sat in companionable silence as the fire was fed again. It was always hungry, always needing, but it gave back tenfold. It warmed their backs and dried their boots, and made shadows that felt like friends across the walls. And as the snow continued to fall outside in soft, endless silence, Lydia watched her family, their cheeks pink, their shoulders eased, their hands moving steadily through the tasks of another day. She felt the weight of the cold all around them, but not within. Within, there was warmth. Within, there was enough. That afternoon settled into stillness, again an unbroken, unhurried hush that seemed to stretch time itself. The snow outside had deepened until the windows looked out onto nothing but white. Fence posts had vanished. The trees stood like silent, sentinels buried to their knees. But inside the cottage, the rhythm of survival pulsed unsteady as breath, slow as embers, soft as a lullaby whispered through steam and soup, and F-I-R-E, it. Lydia stood by the window for a long moment, watching as the flakes drifted sideways, tugged gently by invisible winds. Her reflection was pale and quiet in the glass wool wrapped and lit by the orange glow of the stove behind her. The glass was warm where her breath had fogged it, and through that blur the world outside looked like a dream. She could just make out the thin trail of boot prints Arthur had left when he returned earlier, but already they were filling in. By evening even that path would be gone. Behind her, Eliza was reading aloud again, her voice low and melodic, rising and falling in the rhythm of an old fairy tale one, where brave girls ventured into snowy woods and returned bearing fire. Thomas sat cross-legged near the fire, carefully lining up pine cones along the hearthstone. He was naming each one, as if they were soldiers on some woolly battlefield dot. These quiet winter afternoons were sacred in their own way. Time for mending, for reading, for sitting close. No urgency, no bells, no clocks beyond the soft chime of the hallway pendulum. In many Edwardian homes, this was when family history was passed on not through dramatic storytelling, but through casual, half-whispered remembrance. Lydia, her hands now free, took down the family recipe book. It wasn't really a book at all, just a bundle of parchment pages sewn together with thread, smudged with flour, and fingerprinted with time. The ink was faded, the corners curled, but the knowledge it carried was dense with care. How to stretch dried fruit into a tart filling, how to make soap from rendered fat and wood ash, how to identify the kind of frost that meant snow would stay for days. She read a few lines aloud to Eliza, then traced one of the old drawings her own grandmother's of a clove-studded orange, hung from a ribbon. Pomanders, little balls of citrus and spice, hung in windows to sweeten the air and keep sickness at bay. Lydia remembered making them as a girl, pressing each clove into the skin until her fingers ached. She decided then they would make some tonight as a surprise for the children. The scent alone would be worth it. Arthur was in the back shed, oiling the hinges of the door and recoiling the ropes he used for hauling wood. Winter maintenance never ended. Hinges swelled in the cold, windows warped, and leather tools cracked if not properly cared for. Even in the simplest cottages, Edwardians became expert caretakers, not just of people, but of things, because every item, every possession was a piece of your survival. You learned to listen to the creak of a door, the stiffness of a boot, the sound of wood burning too quickly. These were the signs of what needed mending, what needed saving, what needed protecting. By the time dusk approached, Lydia had begun pressing cloves into the oranges. Thomas joined her, carefully copying her technique, squinting with concentration as he pushed each spice into the skin. Eliza tied loops of ribbon onto the finished ones and hung them near the hearth. The air was soon thick with that warm, sharp fragrance, sweet orange, woody clove, and the faint must of wool and firewood, the kind of scent that settled in the walls and became memory, the kind that years later might be stirred up in a shop or garden and make someone pause and close their eyes without knowing why. For supper, Lydia made a barley porridge thickened with leftover bones, carrots, and a pinch of thyme from the dried bundle above the stove. She moved slowly, thoughtfully, humming softly. She used the flat side of her knife to crush the barley, releasing more of its body into the broth. The stew bubbled gently for hours, until the whole kitchen was fragrant and full. They ate by candlelight, bowls steaming in their hands, the air around them cooled, just enough that the heat from the food made their cheeks flush. Arthur said little, but his gaze was content as he watched Lydia and the children, the flickering flame reflected in his eyes. After supper, Lydia brought out the sewing basket again, not because anything urgently needed mending, but because her hands liked to be busy while her ears listened. The children sat at her feet. Arthur leaned against the wall with his pipe unlit, turning an old coin over and over between his fingers. An old silver penny from Queen Victoria's last year, kept as a charm, as a reminder. And then, as they often did on nights like this, they told stories. Not fantastical ones, not loud or exaggerated, but true stories, family stories. Lydia spoke of the winter her mother had survived with nothing but oat bread and snowmalt tea, and how neighbors had passed around a single sack of flour between 5 households. Arthur told of his father's coal cart overturning in a blizzard, and how it took 4 men to dig it out with their bare hands. These weren't sad stories, not really. They were survival stories, resilience stories, and in the telling they became warmth. The fire, now low, glowed in its quiet way, casting more shadow than light. Lydia covered the grate with a fine screen. to catch any rogue sparks and bank the embers beneath ash once again. The children were sent to bed with warm bricks and hugs, and the lingering scent of cloves still clinging to their collars. Upstairs, the wind had returned soft and steady, like someone whispering just outside the window. The snow tapped gently against the glass, but the beds were warm, the quilts layered thick, and the house held its peace like a closed book. On a bedside table, Lydia stood at the window once more, one hand on the pane, her breath fogging a small circle of glass. Through it she could see only snow and a dim glow from the neighbor's cottage. But she smiled because she knew behind that glow was another fire, another mother banking coals, another family sleeping safe against the dark. So the night deepened, and the house, wrapped in memory and spice and careful rituals, drifted into silence once more. That afternoon settled into stillness again, an unbroken, unhurried hush that seemed to stretch time itself. The snow outside had deepened until the windows looked out onto nothing but white. Fence posts had vanished. The trees stood like silent sentinels buried to their knees. But inside the cottage, the rhythm of survival pulsed on, steady as breath, slow as embers, soft as a lullaby whispered through steam and soup and fireligt. Lydia stood by the window for a long moment, watching as the flakes drifted sideways, tugged gently by invisible winds. Her reflection was pale and quiet, and the glass wall wrapped and lit by the orange glow of the stove behind her. The glass was warm where her breath had fogged it, and through that blur, the world outside looked like a dream. She could just make out the thin trail of boot prints Arthur had left when he returned earlier, but already they were filling in. By evening, even that path would be gone. Behind her, Eliza was reading aloud again, her voice low and melodic, rising and falling in the rhythm of an old fairy tale one, where brave girls ventured into snowy woods and returned bearing fire. Thomas sat cross-legged near the fire, carefully lining up pine cones along the hearthstone. He was naming each one as if they were soldiers on some woolly battlefield dot. These quiet winter afternoons were sacred in their own way. Time for mending, for reading, for sitting close. No urgency, no bells, no clocks beyond the soft chime of the hallway pendulum. In many Edwardian homes, this was when family history was passed on not through dramatic storytelling, but through casual, half-whispered remembrance. Lydia, her hands now free, took down the family recipe book. It wasn't really a book at all, just a bundle of parchment pages sewn together with thread, smudged with flour, and fingerprinted with time. The ink was faded, the corners curled, but the knowledge it carried was dense with care. How to stretch dried fruit into a tart filling, how to make silk from rendered fat and wood ash, how to identify the kind of frost that meant snow would stay for days. She read a few lines aloud to Eliza, then traced one of the old drawings, her own grandmother's, of a clove-studded orange, hung from a ribbon. Pomanders, little balls of citrus and spice, hung in windows to sweeten the air and keep sickness at bay. Lydia remembered making them as a girl, pressing each clove into the skin until her fingers ached. She decided then they would make some tonight as a surprise for the children. The scent alone would be worth it. Arthur was in the back shed, oiling the hinges of the door and recoiling the ropes he used for hauling wood. Winter maintenance never ended. Hinges swelled in the cold, windows warped, and leather tools cracked if not properly cared for. Even in the simplest cottages, Edwardians became expert caretakers not just of people, but of things, because every item, every possession was a piece of your survival. You learned to listen to the creak of a door, the stiffness of a boot, the sound of wood burning too quickly. These were the signs of what needed mending, what needed saving, what needed protecting. By the time dusk approached, Lydia had begun pressing cloves into the oranges. Thomas joined her, carefully copying her technique, squinting with concentration as he pushed each spice into the skin. Eliza tied loops of ribbon onto the finished ones and hung them near the hearth. The air was soon thick with that warm, sharp fragrance, sweet orange, woody clove, and the faint must of wool and firewood, the kind of scent that settled in the walls and became memory, the kind that years later might be stirred up in a shop or garden and make someone pause and close their eyes without knowing why. For supper, Lydia made a barley porridge thickened with leftover bones, carrots, and a pinch of thyme from the dried bundle above the stove. She moved slowly, thoughtfully, humming softly. She used the flat side of her knife to crush the barley, releasing more of its body into the broth. The stew bubbled gently for hours, until the whole kitchen was fragrant and full. They ate by candlelight, bowls steaming in their hands, the air around them cooled just enough that the heat from the food made their cheeks flush. Arthur said little, but his gaze was content as he watched Lydia and the children, the flickering flame reflected in his eyes. After supper, Lydia brought out the sewing basket again, not because anything urgently needed mending, but because her hands liked to be busy while her ears listened. The children sat at her feet. Arthur leaned against the wall with his pipe unlit, turning an old coin over and over between his fingers, an old silver penny from Queen Victoria's last year, kept as a charm, as a reminder. And then, as they often did on nights like this, they told stories, not fantastical ones, not loud or exaggerated, but true stories, family stories. Lydia spoke of the winter her mother had survived with nothing but oat bread and snowmalt tea, and how neighbors had passed around a single sack of flour between 5 households. Arthur told of his father's coal cart overturning in a blizzard, and how it took 4 men to dig it out with their bare hands. These weren't sad stories, not really. They were survival stories, resilience stories, and in the telling they became warmth. The fire, now low, glowed in its quiet way, casting more shadow than light. Lydia covered the grate with a fine screen to catch any rogue sparks and bank the embers beneath ash once again. The children were sent to bed with warm bricks and hugs, and the lingering scent of cloves still clinging to their collars. Upstairs, the wind had returned soft and steady, like someone whispering just outside the window. The snow tapped gently against the glass, but the beds were warm, the quilts layered thick, and the house held its peace like a closed book on a bedside table. Lydia stood at the window once more, one hand on the pane, her breath fogging a small circle of glass. Through it she could see only snow and a dim glow from the neighbor's cottage. But she smiled because she knew behind that glow was another fire, another mother banking coals, another family sleeping safe against the dark. So the night deepened, and the house, wrapped in memory and spice and careful rituals, drifted into silence more. The snow slowed some time after dark, drifting gently into silence like the last few words of a bedtime story. Outside, the world seemed wrapped in wool, each house tucked beneath its own snowy quilt. Smoke rose from chimneys and soft gray plumes, the smell of coal and peat lingering in the frozen air. It was the kind of evening that felt suspended in time, where nothing moved too quickly, and even the wind took its time curling around corners. Inside Lydia's cottage, the light had grown low and golden, cast by oil lamps and firelight alone. Shadows swayed gently across the walls. The room smelled of suet pudding, dried herbs, and old pine from the stack of kindling drying near the hearth. Arthur sat near the fire, his legs stretched out, a mug of tea warming his hands. He wasn't drinking it quickly. It was the kind of tea meant to be held more than sipped, steeped long and sipped slow. Lydia was retying bundles of dried thyme and rosemary, their stems crumbling slightly under her fingers. These bundles hung above the stove, used for both seasoning and scent. In Edwardian households, dried herbs were as common as flour. They added warmth to bland winter meals, helped with coughs and colds, and when dropped into simmering water, filled a home with a comfort that went beyond hunger. Thomas sat on the floor, rolling yarn into a tight ball for his mother. Eliza, curled into the old armchair by the corner, was darning one of her mittens, her stitches a little crooked but steadily improving. The quiet work of hands and fire was its own kind of music, no instruments needed. The occasional creak of the house, the pop of resin in the wood, the soft sniffle from Thomas's nose, all of it folded into the peaceful soundscape of an Edwardian evening, when the pudding was unwrapped, steaming, golden flecked with bits. Of carrot the children's eyes lit up, and even Arthur gave a low, appreciative hum. Lydia served it in chipped bowls, still warm from being set near the stove. A splash of treacle over the top made it feel festive, even sacred. It was not a feast, but it was abundance by their measure. In winters like this, you learn not to chase luxury. You savored presence, warmth, hands holding bowls, candlelight caught in eyelashes. After dessert, Arthur read from the newspaper. What little of it was still relevant. The copy had arrived. A week late, and the pages were smudged, the corners curled, but it still held value. The children listened quietly to a short article about train delays in London, about an unusually harsh frost in Sussex. The news, though distant, grounded them. It reminded them they were part of a larger world, even as their own felt so small and enclosed. Later, as the children readied for bed, Lydia filled a basin with warm water for their feet, a tradition passed down from her grandmother. Soaking cold feet before sleep didn't just warm the body, it settled the nerves. Thomas grinned sleepily as she dried his toes with a rough towel, and Eliza thanked her in a whisper as she slipped into her wool nightdress, already warmed by the brick nestled at the foot of her bed. Before blowing out the candle, Lydia paused. The children's room was dim, their breath faint in the cold air. They were nestled like kittens beneath layers of wool and feather and flannel. She tucked the blankets in tighter, smoothing the creases, brushing back stray curls. Their cheeks were flushed, their eyelids heavy. They didn't fight the sleep, they welcomed it, as all Edwardian children did in winter, when days were full and bodies tired early. Downstairs, Arthur had returned to the hearth. The fire was low again, but not out. He stirred it once more, adjusted the iron grate, and sat with his hands on his knees. Lydia joined him, folding herself into the old chair beside his, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was understood, shared, reverent. She looked toward the mantel, at the line of pomanders now hanging in a neat row. Their fragrance had begun to rise, cutting through the thickness of the firewood smoke. They would last weeks like this, drying slowly in the warmth, their scent growing deeper over time, a gift to the future in a season so often built. Unmemory. Arthur finally broke the silence, his voice low, gravelly from the dry air. "My father used to say winter was a teacher," he murmured. "Taught you what mattered, who mattered." Lydia nodded, eyes on the fire. "And taught you how to wait," she whispered. "How to love quiet things." A log shifted. The flames leaned sideways, casting the shadows of their faces long against the wall. They sat like that a while longer, listening to the crackle of wood and the faint whistle of wind at the window panes. Somewhere outside, an owl called a single soft note that floated across the field and was swallowed by Snow Dot. Eventually, Arthur banked the fire for the night. The ashes would hold the heat. The kettle was moved back to its usual place. The lamp was turned down until its wick flickered low. Dot in their bedroom. The bed waited, still heavy with quilts, still holding the faint heat of yesterday's breath. Lydia smoothed the sheets, placed a warm brick at her feet, and settled beside her. Husband. The darkness around them was velvet. The wind outside had grown tired. The house exhaled. Dot. This was the heart of winter. Not the glittering frost or howling wind, but the stillness between. The quiet. The careful acts of love passed from hand to hand. The flame, small and persistent, burning just enough to carry them to tomorrow. The snow slowed sometime after dark, drifting gently into silence like the last few words of a bedtime story. Outside, the world seemed wrapped in wool, each house tucked beneath its own snowy quilt. Smoke rose from chimneys in soft gray plumes, the smell of coal and peat lingering in the frozen air. It was the kind of evening that felt suspended in time, where nothing moved too quickly, and even the wind took its time curling around corners. Inside Lydia's cottage, the light had grown low and golden, cast by oil lamps and firelight alone. Shadows swayed gently across the walls. The room smelled of suet pudding, dried herbs, and old pine from the stack of kindling drying near the hearth. Arthur sat near the fire, his legs stretched out, a mug of tea warming his hands. He wasn't drinking it quickly. It was the kind of tea meant to be held more than sipped, steeped long and sipped slow. Lydia was retying bundles of dried thyme and rosemary, their stems crumbling slightly under her fingers. These bundles hung above the stove, used for both seasoning and scent. In Edwardian households, dried herbs were as common as flour. They added warmth to bland winter meals, helped with coughs and colds, and when dropped into simmering water, filled a home with a comfort that went beyond hunger. Thomas sat on the floor, rolling yarn into a tight ball for his mother. Eliza, curled into the old armchair by the corner, was darning one of her mittens, her stitches a little crooked but steadily improving. The quiet work of hands and fire was its own kind of music, no instruments needed. The occasional creak of the house, the pop of resin in the wood, The soft sniffle from Thomas's nose, all of it folded into the peaceful soundscape of an Edwardian evening, when the pudding was unwrapped, steaming, golden flecked with bits of carrot. The children's eyes lit up, and even Arthur gave a low, appreciative hum. Lydia served it in chipped bowls, still warm from being set near the stove. A splash of treacle over the top made it feel festive, even sacred. It was not a feast, but it was abundance by their measure. In winters like this, you learned not to chase luxury. You savored presence, warmth, hands holding bowls. Candlelight caught in eyelashes. After dessert, Arthur read from the newspaper. What little of it was still relevant. The copy had arrived. A week late, and the pages were smudged, the corners curled. But it still held value. The children listened quietly to a short article about train delays in London, about an unusually harsh frost in Sussex. The news, though distant, grounded them. It reminded them they were part of a larger world, even as their own felt so small and enclosed. Later, as the children readied for bed, Lydia filled a basin with warm water for their feet, a tradition passed down from her grandmother. Soaking cold feet before sleep didn't just warm the body, it settled the nerves. Thomas grinned sleepily as she dried his toes with a rough towel, and Eliza thanked her in a whisper as she slipped into her wool nightdress, already warmed by the brick nestled at the foot of her bed. Before blowing out the candle, Lydia paused. The children's room was dim, their breath faint in the cold air. They were nestled like kittens beneath layers of wool and feather and flannel. She tucked the blankets in tighter, smoothing the creases, brushing back stray curls. Their cheeks were flushed, their eyelids heavy. They didn't fight the sleep, they welcomed it, as all Edwardian children did in winter, when days were full and bodies tired early. Downstairs, Arthur had returned to the hearth. The fire was low again, but not out. He stirred it once more, adjusted the iron grate, and sat with his hands on his knees. Lydia joined him, folding herself into the old chair beside his, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was understood, shared, reverent. She looked toward the mantel, at the line of pomanders now hanging in a neat row. Their fragrance had begun to rise, cutting through the thickness of the firewood smoke. They would last weeks like this, drying slowly in the warmth, their scent growing deeper over time, a gift to the future, in a season so often built. On memory, Arthur finally broke the silence, his voice low, gravelly from the dry air. "My father used to say winter was a teacher," he murmured. "Taught you what mattered." "Who mattered?" Lydia nodded, eyes on the fire. "And taught you how to wait," she whispered. "How to love quiet things." A log shifted. The flames leaned sideways, casting the shadows of their faces long against the wall. They sat like that a while longer, listening to the crackle of wood and the faint whistle of wind at the window panes. Somewhere outside, an owl called a single soft note that floated across the field and was swallowed by snow. Eventually, Arthur banked the fire for the night. The ashes would hold the heat. The kettle was moved back to its usual place. The lamp was turned down until its wick flickered low in their bedroom. The bed waited, still heavy with quilts, still holding the faint heat of yesterday's breath. Lydia smoothed the sheets, placed the warm brick at her feet, and settled beside her. "Husband," The darkness around them was velvet. The wind outside had grown tired. The house exhaled dust. This was the heart of winter. Not the glittering frost or howling wind, but the stillness between. The quiet. The careful acts of love passed from hand to hand, the flame small and persistent, burning just enough to carry them to tomorrow. That evening, as the fire settled into a low, steady burn and the last candle was lit on the mantel, Lydia moved through the house with the gentle pace of someone cradling time. There was no rush. Now everything had been done. The chores were finished. The meals had been made and shared. The children's boots were drying near the stove. The kettle was full. And the night? The night could finally begin to fold itself around them like a soft cloak. Thomas had fallen asleep early, curled like a field mouse in his little bed beneath a thick patchwork quilt. Lydia had placed a dried sprig of mint beneath his pillow, a calming remedy her mother had once sworn by, passed down like an heirloom. Eliza was still awake, quietly brushing her hair by the lamplight, 100 strokes slow and deliberate. Not because she'd been told to, but because it was tradition, because it soothed the nerves, and because it made her feel as though she were grown. Lydia watched her from the doorway for a moment, before crossing the room to smooth the woolen blanket that lined the edge of her daughter's bed. "It's going to get colder tonight," she whispered. Eliza nodded and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'll keep the candle," she said softly. Lydia didn't argue. She left it on the bedside table, the flame swaying gently, casting golden light across the whitewashed wall. Back downstairs, Arthur was tending to the fire with a quiet focus that bordered on reverence. He turned the poker slowly, shifting the logs until the coals beneath glowed red and full. "Ashes for sleeping, flame for waking," he murmured, one of those old sayings his father used to repeat. Lydia smiled. "And warmth all the hours between." She handed him a small tin of salve she'd made from beeswax and goose grease, infused with rosemary and chamomile. He rubbed it into his cracked hands in silence. They had been splitting wood all week, and the skin across his knuckles was rough, almost brittle. But this too was part of winter, the tending of the body, the soft work of repair that mirrored the season's own. Hidden stillness. The air inside the house had thickened with that familiar evening mixture wood smoke, wool, lamp oil, and the faint sweetness of whatever herbs still clung to the drapes. These were the smells of safety, of home. Outside the snow had stopped, and the moon sat high and round in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. From the upper window you could see the prints of a fox crisp in solitary tracing a winding line across the edge of the garden. Lydia drew the curtains closed and lit another candle. She placed it in the window again, just as she had the night before, a gesture that seemed to carry more meaning than ever. Perhaps it was just a ritual. Perhaps it was hope. Or perhaps it was simply a way of saying, "We're still here." That night, she and Arthur climbed into bed without words. The hot brick had already warmed the foot of the mattress. The quilts were layered high, heavy enough to press the weight of the day away. As she settled against him, Lydia listened to the sounds of their home, the slow tick of the hallway clock, the wind brushing against the shingles, the faint groan of the beams as they adjusted to the cold dot, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of breath his and hers rising and falling like the tide. They slept long and deep, And when they stirred just past midnight, it was not from cold or discomfort, but from that familiar ancestral rhythm, the pause between dreams. Lydia rose first, lit the stub of a candle, and padded quietly into the kitchen. The fire still held its glow. She added a few chips of wood and watched the flame catch again, small but confident. She poured a little tea from the kettle, now lukewarm, and took a sip before setting it back down. Then she did something she rarely did in winter. She opened the door just for a moment, just wide enough to step out into the stillness. The snow crunched beneath her feet, crystalline and fine like sugar. The moon above was wrapped in a ring of light, cold, ethereal, and vast. She took a breath, and the cold filled her lungs like a drink from a mountain stream. The silence was total. Even the village seemed to be holding its breath. She stood there, bareheaded beneath the sky, her shawl pulled tight, her boots tucked into the snow like roots. She didn't speak. She didn't move. And then, just as gently, she stepped back. Inside, shut the door, and returned to the warmth. Back in bed, Arthur stirred and reached for her hand beneath the covers. She took it, held it, and closed her eyes once more. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Outside, the frost thickened on the windows. Inside, the warmth held and in the quiet folds of that old Edwardian cottage, the final hours of the night passed like a slow lullaby, steady, tender, and wrapped in peace. Morning arrived as a whisper softer than breath, lighter than snowfall, barely brushing the edges of the world as it slipped through the still dark skies. It was the kind of morning that didn't announce itself with bird song or brilliant sunbeams. It came slowly, with a pale silver sheen that spread across the snow like milk poured into ink. In the cottage, the warmth lingered like a presence, not from the fire alone, but from the layers of ritual, love, and care laid down each day, like another blanket upon the bed of winter. Lydia stirred beneath the quilts, her eyes fluttering open to the faint blue light seeping through the curtains. The fire had gone low, but not out. The warmth had faded, but not vanished. That was enough. She slipped out of bed carefully, her feet finding the braided rug with familiarity. The chill wrapped around her legs, gentle but firm, like an old friend asking her to move, to wake, to begin again. In the kitchen, the air smelled of ashes and melted snow, of last night's fire and something faintly sweet, perhaps the lingering spice of the pomanders, or maybe just memory. The kettle rattled softly on the stovetop as Lydia moved about with practiced ease. The flint scratched once, twice, then caught. The fire roared gently back to life beneath her hand. She opened the shutters a little, letting in more of that soft, silver light. Outside, everything glistened. The trees shimmered with frost. The lane was untouched, a perfect blanket of white stretching toward the village. It was a new day, and yet it looked just like the one before. That was the way of winter. Its sameness was its rhythm, its repetition a kind of music. The children awoke slowly. Eliza yawned and rubbed her eyes. Her braid unraveled across her shoulder. Thomas padded down the stairs, still wrapped in his blanket, hair wild, cheeks rosy from sleep. Arthur came last, his eyes still heavy with dreams, his shirt half-buttoned, one sock slipping at the heel. Lydia handed him a cup of tea and smiled. There was no need to rush. It was Sunday. Sunday mornings in Edwardian homes moved slower than any other. They were sacred not always in religious ritual, but in spirit. Fires were banked with extra care. The table was laid with the good crockery. A boiled egg, if they could spare it, maybe toast with dripping or the last slice of fruitcake from the tin hidden at the back of the pantry. The food didn't matter as much as the pause, the permission to rest. After breakfast, Lydia read aloud from a book of poetry, her voice low and slow, like honey poured into a warm spoon. The children listened quietly, faces tucked into shawls, toes curled under the quilts they dragged. Down from upstairs, Arthur cleaned his boots in the corner, dabbing at the leather with a soft cloth, humming a tune under his breath. The day passed like smoke slow curling. Almost invisible Dot Eliza helped knead a loaf of bread for tomorrow. Thomas cut shapes out of bits of old cloth for patchwork. Lydia stirred a pot of soup with a rhythm that felt more like prayer than preparation. The snow outside began to melt in patches along the roof, the drip, drip, drip of water tapping out the slow shift of the season. But spring still felt far away, and yet there was no impatience in this house. The cold had taught them to live in each hour, to hold it, soften into it, and let it pass without tugging. No one waited for joy. They made it from what they had got by late afternoon. Arthur returned from the barn with a fresh bundle of kindling and 2 small wooden toys he had carved from scrap. A bird for Eliza with wings that folded. A fox for Thomas, its back legs uneven, but charming. The children squealed softly and held them like treasure. No paint, no gears, just wood and warmth and the weight of their father's time. Before dinner, Lydia walked the edge of the property, her boots crunching into the older snow. She gathered fallen twigs, checked the chicken coop, and watched the sky turn from pale to pewter. In the east, a bank of clouds rolled low and wide, promising more snow by morning. But she felt no dread-only readiness. The pantry was full enough, the wood stacked. The fire sure. Inside, the family gathered once more, drawn together by scent and flame and the fading light. They ate in peace, laughed softly, shared the silence with reverence. When the fire snapped, no one flinched. When the wind moaned, no one hurried to the windows. The world was cold, but their world was warm. That night, they went to bed earlier than usual. The warmth held longer when they shared it more quickly. Arthur wrapped his arms around Lydia in the dark, his fingers tracing slow circles along the edge of her sleeve. "March soon," he whispered. She nodded. "But we'll remember this winter, too." And she was right, because this winter wasn't just cold. It was everything Dot. There was the sound of bread crust breaking in quiet hands, the sight of breath floating like a ghost in early morning light, the feel of quilts layered high with love. It was cloth and wood and wool and water. It was the hiss of coals, the hush of falling snow, the way silence could feel sacred when wrapped around the ones you love. Dot, it was survival, yes, but more than that, it was living. And as the night deepened and the fire dimmed to its final ember, the house exhaled once more, resting in its warmth, not because the winter was over, but because in every careful act they had already made it through